My topic is the future of economic growth, and of course this is a question that everybody has in mind. It's part of the problem, I should say, to start with, that we are also anxious to know what is the future of economic growth, as if in fact it was part of the destiny of society that was indexed on this future, that we couldn't think otherwise. But I'll come to that later. This dependency, this addiction somehow that we all have to economic growth is part of the question that I want to tackle. But let me start by giving kind of a long-run perspective on the topic to see exactly where we are. When economists are asked to give sort of historical perspective on any matter, in particular on the matter of economic growth, they usually follow the very lazy way to say that basically it all boils down to two events, not three, just two. One was the agricultural revolution, sometimes 10,000 years ago, and the other one was the industrial revolution 2 centuries ago. In between, nothing much happened, and we have to understand the reason why we move from one to the other to understand the sustainability of economic growth. Of course, when you look in detail, things are more complicated and they are much more embedded one in the other than it just seems, like thinking of the world as having just two milestones and nothing else in between, as you can imagine. So let me dig a little bit deeper into these two events, because I think they illuminate each in their own way what is going on today with respect to growth, and in particular with respect to our expectations regarding growth. If I start with agriculture, again, an invention that took place in many places in the world at more or less the same time, let's say 10,000 plus or less 2,000 years, if you want to have a broad scope on where agriculture was invented. The point about farming was to give more resources to mankind and to allow mankind to be fed more conveniently. The problem with agriculture, which has been acknowledged some time ago, is that it started well, it allowed people to be better fed, but it always ends in famines. The end of any economic process triggered by agriculture is always human beings starving. So there is a kind of paradox which we need to understand if you want to see the connection with the world into which we are. And the underlying reason why almost all agricultural societies systematically end up in reaching the limit of how much they can feed their own population is associated with what the economists called the law of Malthus, Malthus' law. And this law, which has been announced by Malthus at the end of the 18th century, is itself extremely simple to understand, and to some extent it serves as a model of what the economists are after when they want to understand the world, something as simple, as profound as Malthus' law. And the very simple mechanism behind it is that when people are better fed, well, child mortality is reduced and demography catch up, and in the end, because demography follows what Malthus called what we would call an exponential law, and what Malthus called a geometric law, it goes more rapidly than any possibilities which tend to follow a linear law, if you want to see the time it takes to cultivate more land. So essentially, because the law of compound interest somehow with respect to demography is always faster than the time technology takes in order to till more ground, it is bound to be a necessity that an agricultural society is always ending up in famine. And when Malthus makes this propose this law as a way of understanding the history of human life, obviously he raised a lot of skepticism. How can it be that such a simple, law, just the fact that the demography follows an exponential law, is sufficient to explain why populations are always starving in the end of any economic process, starting with agriculture. Any innovation is always swamped by the strength of economic of demography. in the 19th century, and obviously the simple economic conclusion that is drawn from this law is that the level of income measured by how many calories people eat over their lifetime, the level of income, as we would say in modern terms, is stagnant over the millennia, over the stories of all civilizations. It doesn't rise, it doesn't rise. It's always at the same level, which is about what it takes not to starve. And if by any chance some new technologies are invented to lift up the level of income of any given population, and of course history is itself filled with discoveries that raise the productivity of agriculture itself, then demography will pick up the time it takes before we are back to the same level of starvation that you had before. So according to Malthus' law, the history of the world is not a story about rising level of income per head, but simply a story of rising heads. And when you look at the story of population themselves, when agriculture was invented, there were perhaps something like 10 million people around in the world. At the age of the Christ, it was 200, and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it was something like 1 billion at the beginning of the 19th century. And today, as you know, we'll be adding towards 10 billion by 2050. The reception of this theory in the 19th century was obviously very critical. For the Marxists, it was a non-starter. The idea that poverty could only be explained by demography, biology, was absurd. If there were some poverty in the world, and in particular, obviously at the time when Marx was writing, it was because of the fact that the social relationship, the organization of the market, were creating the condition for the workers to be poor. So it was a social phenomenon, not the biological phenomenon. And for the church, the Catholic Church, very clearly the theory of Malthus was leaning towards sexual restraint or any kind of contraception, and that was not well granted either. So on both sides of the spectrum, Malthus' law was not well accepted. It took many time, it took many years, many research, in order for the economic profession. I would say it's in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a huge renewal in the study of economic history that led to the conclusion that Malthus was right, that perhaps for 10,000 years, the level of income, however we measure it, again in terms of calories, has stagnated at the level which is today the level of income of the poorest people on earth, something like $1 per head. That is $500 per year. That's the standard that the economic historian has converged toward. Whatever civilization we are looking at, whatever time horizon we are looking at, on average, the level of income was just stagnating at about this $1 point something per day, per head. And looking at some direct evidence, like the size of skeletons, you would see that they are not growing over the millennia, just staying at about the same size, which is another indication that there was not much of economic growth as we define it today for most of the history of humanity, at least starting with the Neolithic and the invention of agriculture. Further research has developed this notion, and in particular, a Danish economist in the 1960s has challenged Malthus' law. This economist's name is Esther Boserup, and she demonstrated that whenever there were the kind of bottlenecks in agriculture that Malthus explained would be the ultimate fate of any agricultural society, the pressure would always be a decisive push towards more innovation. And she sort of developed this idea that humans always found ways of circumventing Malthus' law by finding new techniques in due time, which allow humanity to go always beyond. And in the economics profession, after Esther Boserup's book, published in the 1960s, there were like two schools, Boserup or Malthus. You had to pick up which one of the two you were, the stagnationist, the Malthusian, or the positivist, the optimist. Yeah, we'll find solutions, we can always go beyond that. And it's only very recently, when we speak about this long time horizon, it's surprising there are still researchers finding new things about that. It's only recently, in 1992 or 3, basically, that an economist at Harvard, Michael Kramer, showed that these two laws these two visions of what was going on for that period were not at all antagonistic, but in fact complementary. Indeed, human beings always go to the point of starvation, from which they go beyond, and go to starvation, and beyond, beyond, beyond. So the point is that populations' incomes are indeed stagnant over a medium period, as Malthus explained, but in growing numbers. Malthus believed that it was just exponential, and what in fact Kramer, using both kind of methodology, has demonstrated is that it was faster than exponential, because the growth rate of population was itself a positive function of the number of people. The more people you have, the more solution you have, and growth was picking up with the number of people. So I'm speaking to physicists, and I hope that I will not say stupidity here, but a law of motion in which the growth rate is a positive of a state variable, is a positive function of the state variable, is bound to explode in finite time. And in fact, when you look at the numbers by Kramer, the way he estimates the relationship over how many years, how many points an estimate he can have, you do see that the growth rate is rising. He didn't go to the point where he estimated the moment when humanity was supposed to explode out of this process. But you can play with it and find some estimates. But just very coincidentally, reading a book written by demographers 20 or 30 years ago, who were completely unaware of this controversy, they did estimate, extrapolating the trends, the speed at which, the time at which this exponential, super exponential law of motion would reach its limit. And they claimed that if it was left to itself, humanity would have exploded, like in a nuclear reaction, on November 13, 2026. And when you look Kramer's estimates, and you guys just did it with Excel, just writing the thing to see when it explodes, it's not that far. It's between 2050, not exactly that 13th of November. But it's just showing something extraordinary, which is that mankind was embarked into a process which was leading to its explosion way before the Industrial Revolution. Just by the sheer law of rising numbers, rising infinity, and even faster as the stock of population was increasing. The interesting lesson is that it will not happen, but for reasons that nobody predicted, not even Malthus nor anyone else, which is the demographic transition. Suddenly, without any prior notice, in less than a century, the number of children per woman fell dramatically, first in Europe and then in the rest of the world. As we are embarked today, the demographic transition is about to end by 2050. It's already there, obviously, in Europe. It's already there in most of Asia. And it's coming on in Africa as well. The number of children per woman is losing 1 unit every decade, exactly the way it happened in the other countries. It started later, in 1918 and so, but it's going on. And according to the UN, the demographic transition will be finished by 2050, by which the number of children per woman will be at 1.85 supposedly. So past 2050, if you read this extrapolation, the number of people would diminish exponentially to the point where, I don't know when, but the calculation really said there will be no more human sometimes in the very, very long run. The point about this demographic transition, as I said, is that nobody expected it. And some economists claim that it's the endogenous result of the Industrial Revolution itself. We become richer, therefore we change our behavior and so on. But it's not settled, it's not quite neat, this argument that as you grow richer, you have less children and you take more care of them. Gary Becker, the prize winner, made this point that we are heading from quantity to quality as we get richer. because in a sense what the economists would call the opportunity cost of rearing children as reason, and women find that they have other activities than simply staying at home, and that they could work and make more money and therefore get these resources otherwise than simply staying at home. But the reality is that first the demographic transition started in France in the 18th century, before the Industrial Revolution. It was more a cultural fact because the French were caring more about the equality of treatment of the children, so they had to cut the number that they had in order to reduce the problem of inheritance. And in the emerging countries today, when you look at the demographic transition, it is not so much correlated to the number of women working. It happened in the countryside as much as in the cities, and it's not a question of whether they work or not. It seems that, there's been again a lot of studies on that, that it's more correlated to the number of TV sets that you have in the cities than to anything else. So it's more a cultural change that, strictly speaking, an economic change. Women in Brazil in particular, but this thing has been studied, stop having children in the number that they had before when they see on television an idea of liberty that interests them. They want to be like this woman that they see, want to drive their car and not stay home. So it has more to do with a cultural shift than an economic shift, strictly speaking. But the end result is there. Suddenly, without notice, without any prediction that this would happen, the destiny of the world changed. And we moved into the Industrial Revolution. So that's the stage 2 of the economic history, such as narrated by the economists themselves. Past the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century, and certainly within the 19th century and 20th century, income per head, not just heads, although heads kept rising for some time, income per head started to rise. And we left the Malthusian world of stagnation towards a new world of economic growth and prosperity. Malthus' law has been vanquished, and we are all grateful for that. And the question, however, is the following. Malthus' law is a fascinating story about the history of the world, but what is perhaps more fascinating than this law in retrospect is that perhaps it was not understood by the civilization under which it was operating. When you look at the treaties of ethnology, the Lévi-Strauss of the world and so on, they spend ages explaining the laws of kinship, who are you entitled to marry at which age, and things like that, but they never mention demography. So it is either because they are stupid, they didn't see that it was all about demography, or more reasonably because the population that they were studying were not concerned with demography. They were subject to a law that they failed to understand. This is open to debate, I don't quite know the answer, but it seems convincing that this idea that population growth was always outstripping the abilities that any civilization had to feed itself was not perceived as such, understood as such. And it was just a process that changes the way civilization were evolving without this civilization really understanding what was going on. And again, the demographic transition was not understood at the time, and certainly was not directly the outcome of an economic process. So today we're happy because we can get richer and richer. Economic growth is lifting up the level of income. But it could very well be that we are the victim of a variant of Malthusian law. A law which determines our lives without us understanding it. So what is this law about? What is it that perhaps we fail to understand and which drives our lives exactly in the same way former civilization, agrarian civilization, was driven by law that they failed to understand. My suggestion to you is the following paradox, which is known in the economic profession as the paradox of Easterling's paradox. Easterling is a demographer, a professor in the US, he must be 85 or so today, still alive and well, and writing a number of papers. And Easterling, which I take to be all Malthus, made an interesting insight in a paper that was published in a conference volume in 1974, in which he used a lot of interviews on the well-being of people, polls which he assembled into a non-publishable paper for the conference for him, so he brought together whatever he could find, in which he claims that if you look at the level of well-being of people, such as they are declared by the people themselves, are you happy, not happy, sad, happy, and so on, they show no trend, no increase at all for however long he could stretch back his data into the past. The Japanese in 1974 were finishing a period of very fast economic growth, recovery after the war and so on. And you could have no indication that the Japanese were happier in 1974 than they were in 1954. And this Eastern paradox has been summarized in the academic profession as the fact that our level of income may be rising, contrary to what happened with Malthus, but our level of welfare or well-being is stagnating exactly in the same way the level of income of the agrarian societies were stagnating in the past. Again, when, just like for Malthus, when Easterlin published this paper, there was a lot of reaction against it, but it's not scientific, asking people what they think, I don't know if I'm happy or not, and so on. And so there's been a lot of work on whether these polls, these surveys, are you happy, not happy, had any scientific value. So 40 years has passed, and yes, the consensus of the profession is that they have a lot of scientific value. When you ask people, are you happy or unhappy, those who say they are unhappy are more likely to suicide themselves in the next 10 years, to divorce from their husbands or wife, if both say that they are unhappy. We see patterns that repeat themselves again and again. For instance, there's a very interesting pattern that demonstrates that when you ask over many cohorts whether they're happy or not happy, on average, the happiest are the kids around 20, 25, and then there is this kind of U-curve that you find everywhere, which is past 25, the level of happiness everywhere falls from a higher number to a lower number until about, let me see the audience, but about 50, 55. And then it starts climbing again, back to when you are 70 and more, the level that you reach. I don't say that to be happy with you, it's just in the data. Just to go back to the level that you reach when you were in your early 20s. And there are many explanations for this phenomena, certainly the fact that when you start working with children and so on, it's all very nice, but everyone knows that it's a lot of drain in your life, and when they go out, then you know who you are, achieve more or less what you wanted to do in your life, you become happy again, just like you were when you were happy. So there is a very regular relationship between the two. We also know, obviously, how to appreciate, how to measure the extent to which this self-declared happiness finds itself objectively in some other measures, for the brain, scanners, people happy, not happy, and all this has been correlated in many different ways. And in the end, yes, there's a lot of people not always skeptics. There's a lot of people who take very seriously this Eastern paradox. There's many journals which are just dedicated to this Eastern paradox, and there's still a lot of controversy, but I would say that the profession now accepts that there is a lot of truth to that. But certainly when you look at the US, and there's no discussion about that, the level of well-being has been falling regularly from 1960 until now. And this is one point that everybody grants to be true. It's more debatable in other countries, but certainly in the US, which is the richest, and the one which is at the frontier of income and of happiness, perhaps, it's been going down. In the case of France, the level of well-being on average is exactly today at the same level as it was in 1970, although we are twice richer in comparison. So correlation over the years between the level of well-being and the level of income is very, very weak and sometimes negative, and in some cases hardly positive, certainly not significantly enough to believe that this is the driving force. So why is the explanation of our Malthusian law, if you accept that as the Eastern or Malthus of the day? Well, it's very simple. It boils down to two possible explanations, and of course both of them can be right together, and perhaps in some deeper way of looking at things, they They may be both versions of the same thing. One is simply what psychologists call habituation. The humans get used to everything. You put someone in a closet, after a year he gets used to it. Whatever the level of income that you have, it becomes very rapidly the new normal. And the Darwinian interpretation of that is that the human species has this ability that the other species may not have to adapt to their environment and to be just sensitive to variations. We may be sleeping in a subway, in the end we get used to the noise, provided that it's regular. And just get awakened by the irregularities of the noise. So that may be one thing, and certainly it works for income. You get used to what you have. It becomes the new normal very fast. We have a lot of things that we play with. It creates happiness. We have this smartphone in our pocket and so on. It creates happiness at the very beginning, and very soon it becomes the normal. Of course, you are unhappy if this is not taken away from you. And perhaps you get used to it afterwards, but it doesn't give you the same impulse as the very first X months, years, and things tend to go back to normal. That's one explanation, biology explanation. So the other one is more straightforward, is that human beings do not know what they are, and they always compare themselves to the other ones to understand who they are. A guy, famous philosopher, famous in France, René Girard, has built his entire theory of this idea of mimetism. We are afraid of not understanding what is our soul or being, and we are always looking at the other guys to see what is the desire that this other guy may have of things, object relationship, and we sort of use that as a way of trying to understand what is it that we want. We always have the psychoanalytical way of looking at the super egos which tell us what is it that we want to desire. So all this makes desire, the quest for well-being, essentially a relative thing. You're never happy per se. You're only happy when you achieve things which are beyond your expectations, which are beyond what the other guy is doing. A famous specialist of consumption, Harvard professor in the 1950s, James Duterbury, analyzed the pattern of consumption of the US society, showed that the driver of consumption was really the consumption of your neighbors, more than your own income, which explains why sometimes the US can go in debt widely, like in the last crisis, just in order to keep consuming. And he kept that phenomena, keep up with the Joes. The Joes are the neighbors. Go and look like the neighbors and try to follow up what they are doing. And again, in the way of looking at things, there's been a lot of experiments that have been done to show this, that you are driven by the desire to have the same fate as your reference points. In particular, there's been a study showing that when a woman is married to a man who earns less than her own sister, she has a probability of working which is above the probability of working of her sister. She wants to catch up with her own sister. That's a fact that has been found again and again. The tragedy is the tragedy of the brother-in-law. If you have a brother-in-law which is richer than you, you're unhappy. And there is a famous joke in the 19th century about that. Being happy, being rich is just earning £1 more than your brother-in-law. That's a famous joke. So that's what the Easterlin paradox is all about. So it's funny, we like it, but it's a driver of what we are trying to achieve in our societies at the time of huge climatic risk, is to catch up with the brother-in-law. Then it deserves that we pause a bit and make sure that we want to keep on going on with this process. The point anyway, and this is a matter of introduction to this lecture, the point is that all societies are eager, not of wealth, but of economic growth. We need growth, not wealth, because wealth doesn't care. After some time, we don't care being rich or poor in any given society. The growth is what gives us, to each of us, at least the illusion that we'll reach our expectation, the illusion that yes, what the other guy desires, we'll have it too, without fully understanding, A, that we'll get used to it, and B, that if all boats are lifted up together, the other guy, the brother-in-law, will also be richer than he was. Right? This process has to be renewed again and again, because it's an endless race against your neighbors. So that's the point where we are. And clearly, all democratic societies encourage this. In a democratic society, as opposed to a society, a rural society with lords, dukes, and peasants, in the democratic societies, all comparisons are allowed. You see a rich guy, you want to be like him. You wouldn't think likewise if you were a peasant and you see your prince or your duke. You must stay where you are, so you don't even look at him as a possibility for your own destiny. But in democracies, yes, you want to think of yourself as the equal, potentially, of the other guys, and therefore the race is always open. This is exactly what Stokely was saying of the democracy in the US. You think you get rid of those hierarchies of the feudal system only to discover that you enter into a never-ending race against your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues that you want to outpace. And that's the world in which we are. Precisely, if I come back to the idea which emerged in the 18th century, at the eve of the other big process, which is the democratic process, certainly the idea of the 18th century that emerged is the idea of progress. It's a new idea which is itself, it's an old idea which has been recycled with a strength that you don't find in previous civilizations. This idea that man is perfectible, as Rousseau would say, and that he can always improve himself and his human lot. This idea comes a century after the scientific revolution, the revolution, if I can say, the 17th revolution. With the 17th scientific revolution, the European societies discovered the fact that the universe was infinite, as opposed to finite, the way Aristotle and the ancient philosophers used to think about it. Infinite, but void. Void of any presence, of any divine presence, and all the debate between Pascal and Descartes in front was about, is God still there? And Descartes said, yeah, I think he is. And Pascal answering, no, the world that you described, world, God started maybe at the very beginning to put things in motion, but he disappeared after a while. And there's been a huge existential crisis in European circles by the end of the 17th century, as who are we if we are deprived of the belief in a religious world? And the answer was the 18th century Enlightenment revolution, in which people say, well, we can make our own happiness by ourselves rather than waiting for a resurrection that may never come. This idea of progress in the 18th century philosophers' world is a moral idea, it's a political idea, but also has in mind that the human lot can improve their moral behavior, the political system can be improved. Descartes, as you all know, has said that man could be like the master of nature, and the philosophers of the 18th century respond, well, we can be the master at least of the society in which we live. So it's an idea of moral, of political progress, and certainly not an idea of material progress. And yet, the content that will be given to this idea of progress is the idea of material progress. From the 19th century on, the idea of progress that becomes the way of thinking about the future of society will be the idea of material progress with all the caveats that I just said. But still, when we look at things this way, it's not sufficient. And here I'm borrowing from a sociologist, a famous sociologist called Ronald Inglehart, who makes a very interesting distinction within the industrial society between two ages that allow us to see what is this idea of progress really becoming in practice. Inglehart makes this point that the first age of the industrial society precisely of the industrial society, be it the 19th or let's say the 20th industrial society that is associated with the electricity age and all that, the assembly line, is a society in which the secular values replace the religious values, so the engineers become the priests of the modern world, but the way the society is organized remains very much hierarchical, just like in the agrarian society. That is, you don't have a duke, a prince, and so on, but you have an engineer, you have a worker, you have in between middle management. And if you think about the way the industrial societies that come up with Ford and the Taylorist way of organizing labor is all about, it's a society which remains very much obedient, vertical, just like the agrarian society. And so for Engelhardt, this first phase that ranged until, let's say, the 1950s or 60s, is one in which secular values, yes, replace the religious values, but the society remains vertical and obedient, just like the agrarian society, organized societies before. So the democratic promise of a society such as the Enlightenment thought about it is, yes, confirmed by the process of economic growth. You lift people's income above their initial condition. You give them the illusion that they will raise above their initial condition, which is what democracy is all about. But on the other hand, sociologically speaking, within the factory, you remain in the old world. And in fact, the Enlightenment is all about freedom, autonomy of thinking, autonomy of action. Within the factory, you have no such things. And if you think about the criticism of Marx against liberalism in the sense of the 18th century, it's exactly about that. You're speaking about freedom, go into a factory. You will see kids working. Where is the freedom that the Enlightenment philosopher promised to us? So for Engelhardt, this is just one phase. A phase in which the industrial society promises material goods and material progress, but turns its back to the promise of emancipation, the promise of autonomy, freedom of thought and action. In fact, when you think about what is sometimes viewed as a contradiction, let's say in China, between the democratic system that we don't see there and the industrial society, we tend to think with the lenses of the Enlightenment. Democracy and capitalism must go hand in hand. They must come together. They are the children of the same philosophical school. And if you follow Engelhardt, you see that not at all. Only by the promise of raising the income of the people, but certainly not in their daily lives. And as you know, Henry Ford, the founder of Fordism and the one who produced cars in huge numbers, was himself a fan and admirer of Hitler. And Hitler himself was an admirer of Ford. He liked the way Ford thought about the orientation of labor. That was very representative of the kind of society that he had in mind. And so the idea that there should be an inner contradiction between the industrial society and the promises of democracy is certainly not founded into what we've observed, at least until World War II. But now if you follow Engelhardt, what he says beyond that is that the post-industrial society, the service society, to put it very simply, the one where production takes place outside the factories of the early 20th or the 19th century, here you see the promise of a new society coming in. According to Engelhardt, the verticality of the industrial production gives rise to more horizontality. Just like we are among colleagues in a research institute, we are among equals. There's no hierarchical, of course, we praise some luminaries more than others, but within the idea that we are all in the same category of brothers somehow. And so for Engelhardt, what the industrial revolution failed to deliver, the post-industrial revolution, the revolution of knowledge-based, I would say, economies, will deliver it. And Engelhardt has made a lot of polls himself in the tradition of history. He interviewed many people, and he shows, looking at a full range of societies, China, Japan, France, the US, and so on, that secular values replace religious values when industry is dominant, when the shop worker working factories is large, so that's exactly what you just described. But then when you move to a service society, you see that other values emerge, like self-expression, like the pursuit of happiness, more qualitative values. And Engelhardt claimed that we are on the verge, and I would frame that in the context of history, of getting out of the historic paradox, because the post-materialist society, according to him, is about to happen. And for Engelhardt, the reason why this is bound to happen is simply the result of the fact that we are rich, we have the welfare state, every kid now go to school, so they get rid of superstition and so on. So we are about to embark, at last, into the world that the Enlightenment in the 18th century promised. Now that was Engelhardt 10 or 15 years ago. The sad reality is that this promise did not happen. Engelhardt says, we finally get out of the problem of insecurity. We are reaching out and think about eating. Well, the reality is that insecurity is at the core of what this post-industrial society is producing. We've never been so unsecure of our economic destiny than in current societies. And the idea that a post-materialist society is about to happen, that we finally do not care about economic growth, is not sustained today in the data. And we find that when you ask people, what is it that you care more about? 75% say my financial situation. So it has not come out. And we need to understand where is Engelhardt's predictions fail, because he finds that in the poll that he conducts, when you ask people about what they want to get out of this materialistic world, but they can't. And there are basically two explanations for that. One is the Easterlin paradox, which is Easterlin fails to Engelhardt fails to understand what Easterlin explained, that you're never satisfied. In fact, Easterlin himself despised Engelhardt for not understanding what he said about the way things are going on. But there's something more, I think, and this something more has to do with insecurity. The fact that, and this is very important in Engelhardt's demonstration, security is the foundation of what the Enlightenment promises. You need to be secure enough that you can think of other things than just feeding yourself in the broader sense. So we are back to the topic of the we are just starting now the topic of the day, which is then we need to understand not just the future of economic growth in quantitative terms, but we need to understand the qualitative feature of economic growth today, which explains why Engelhardt's prediction is not happening. What is it in this new economic world that makes insecurity more important than at the time when Engelhardt was making his own polls and prediction? So the future of economic growth. I will be brief. Okay. So there are really two schools among the economists as to what it is. And when I say two schools, it's really like a religious war between the believers and the heretics, and this is not a coincidence. It's so important for the economists to deliver a message to the rest of the societies, and provided that they are listened to, economic growth will resume. That saying that perhaps it will not becomes a source of very, very large tension within the profession. So let me start with the economic argument of the believers, those who claim that economic growth will be stronger in the 21st century than it was before. First, they look at the data. In the 18th century, the economic growth per head on average was 0.5% per year. In the 19th century, it was 1%, double the previous number. And in the 20th century, it was 2%. So it multiplies by 2 every century, so the simple extrapolation is that it will be 4 in the 20th century, in the 21st century. And the reason is exactly the one that I alluded to with the Boswell phenomenon. More people, more ideas, and in the Malthusian world, you would go faster and faster. Today, it's not more people, it's more wealth, more ideas, and you go faster and faster. It's exactly the mirror image of this Michael Kramer's demonstration. The reality, obviously, is that in order to sustain the argument of this endogyny of those people, Kramer looked back in the past 10,000 years to demonstrate the validity of this idea that there was a self-fulfilling mechanism generating growth forever after. So that's a way of looking at things which makes a general point that economic growth will follow the pattern of knowledge that we all are experiencing, coming up faster and faster. And again, I was very often quoted by the economist named Ray Kurzweil, who's known for being the leader of the transhumanist group in the US, makes this point that everything happens every time 10 times more rapidly. Every big innovation happens 10 times more rapidly than the previous one. So Sapiens, I'm just rounding up numbers, maybe by a factor of 2 or 3. So Sapiens came up, Homo erectus, came up 1 million years ago. 1.5, I think, but never mind. 1 million years ago, Sapiens, 100,000, 150. Agriculture, 10,000 years ago. The printing press, 1,000 years ago. Electricity, 100 years ago, 200 years, so 150. And the world in which we are happened 10 years ago with the internet. So things go 10 times faster for every major breakthrough. So we are rising, just like in this Malthusian reinterpreted law of motion. It's rising all the time. It's not exponential. It's more than exponential. That's the thing. And the economists like these kind of things. And they say, yes, Moore's law, is driving the world today and multiplied by 2 the power of the microprocessor every 18 months. And we've not seen yet anything of the magnitude that this thing is delivering to us. So one metaphor that 2 MIT distinguished economists called Williamson and McAfee, who wrote a famous book, The Second Machine Age, the story that they like to quote is a story about the chess board that was invented some time ago. And the inventor, the emperor, the Indian emperor that was presented the discovery, as this is a very famous book that you all know, the emperor asked the inventor, what is the reward that you want for this fantastic game? And the guy said, I want 1 grain of rice in the first squares, and then 2, and then 4, and so on, 2 to the power of n, 2 to the power of 64 minus 1, if you add them all. And in the end, obviously, the emperor realized that he has been fooled, that he cannot sustain this demand, this reward, and he shot the head of the inventor as a result. But the point that these guys, Williamson and McAfee, are making is that when the first half of the chessboard has been filled, only the first half, the emperor does not realize that he's fooled, because the first half is reasonable. It's just about 1 field. It's when you enter into the second half of the chessboard that you see the power multiplying everything by 2. So to them, Moore's law, multiplying by 2 every 18 months, is exactly that. We just are in the first half of the chessboard. We are entering into the second half of the chessboard, and you'll see what you'll see. So in particular, and this is Ray Kurzweil speaking again, in 2050, if you just extrapolate the current trend, you will be able to put in a flash disk the totality of the memory contained in a human brain. Just like that. And by 2070, if you keep going on with Moore's law, it's the entire humanity whose memories will be downloaded into a flash disk. And to Ray Kurzweil, this is when what he calls the singularity, the equivalent, the moral, the intellectual equivalent of this nuclear explosion will happen. The intelligence of humanity will saturate the universe. And in passing, we may become immortal. If you follow that. Not necessarily because you can download your memory to a flash disk. It's an interesting thought experiment that you may have. Are you immortal if the flash disk contains all your information? Presumably not. If you were this is what I thought about as a way of understanding. If you were to write in the book all the things that you know, if Edouard would write in the library all the things that he knows, the guy who would read your memoirs would not become yourself. He would transmit information. So I suppose that if we have to change our body through these people, it's over. Yeah. I thought I had 1 hour, so this is what I was for, but it's okay. So that's the optimist. Now the pessimists, what do they say? The pessimists say, fantastic, yeah, we all welcome the possibility of being immortal. But let's look at the data. What happened over the last 30 years? It's not that the last 30 years were a non-event. The last 30 years saw the PCs, the internet, these microchips. We all see a lot of transformation going on. The equipment rate of the smartphone is already 100%. What is growth becoming? Well, it keeps declining. In Europe, it moved from 3 to 2 to 1.5 to 0.5 over the past 5 years, because there was a crisis, the trends were there beforehand. In Japan, there's no growth for more than 20 years. In the US, there is economic growth, but only for the 1% of the population. This is the famous Piketty's result, which is outstanding and co-author sites, demonstrate that even more clearly. 90% of the American population has experienced zero increase of their purchasing power. 90%, not 20, 30, 90%. Half the economic growth has been captured by the 1%, and the rest for the other 10%. So for 90% of the American population, zero growth. And again, it's not that nothing happened. 30 years ago, we would send letters and wait for the response. 3 weeks later, the secretaries were typing, and with no right to make a mistake, otherwise they had to repeat the typing all over again. And when we were waiting for a phone call, an important phone call, we would stay all day long before our phone in order to make sure that we would receive it. So the world has been changed entirely. But growth has not been there. Hence the question, the future of growth, where is it? So why is it, in the view of the pessimist, that growth has not been there? And there are two interpretations. How much is that? 5 minutes or 2? There are two explanations. One is simply that this internet digital revolution brought very little for the consumer. Let's start with the consumer. I'll speak about the producer in a second. Brought very little for the consumer. We all have, speaking of the consumer, we all have our smartphone, and yes, certainly this is a big invention. We all have it. And already we are tired of the idea that maybe the next generation of iPhone or smartphone will force us to change download and all the things. So somehow we already saturate the need for the smartphone. But that is not enough to sustain economic growth. Compare this consumer revolution to what happened at the beginning of the 20th century. Electricity was invented, so the candles gave light to the electric bulb. Elevators were invented, subways were invented, cars were invented, airplanes were invented, movies, radios, television. All this, plus, perhaps more importantly than anything else, a huge boost to agricultural productivity. Agricultural productivity is really a phenomenon of the second industrial revolution. And with the tractors and chemistry needed to make the land more productive. And half the population was still tilling the ground at the beginning of the 20th century in France or in the US. Basically, nobody left, and this has created a huge purchasing power, and the people could see the difference. So all this major revolution, transformation that took place in the 20th century brought 2% per head of economic growth. How much? This is Robert Gordon, a famous professor at Northwestern, speaking. How much do you think your smartphone can deliver? Less than 1, maximum. Don't expect for more. That's one interpretation, a very fascinating one. And when you think in terms of the consumer as to what is it that this new industrial revolution has brought, yes, you can speak all the time with your neighbors and friends and so on. With the smartphone, But in terms of the other goods, it's still cars. They are better, they are cheaper, they make less noise, but still, when you enter into one of them, you always have the same traffic jam, bigger and bigger. The airplanes, it takes the same time to go from New York to Paris. Perhaps, I was speaking of this with the general official, perhaps something is going on, say the magnetic propulsion, which makes possible that we should go to Shanghai in 45 minutes in next years. But it has not yet happened. So for the time being, so far as the consumer is concerned, things are better, but somehow they help us managing what we call in economy the negative externality of the previous revolution. The software that are sold allows you to go through the traffic jam, to share your car with other people because it's too expensive or because you don't want to let it idle. It's not an industrial revolution of the kind when you enter the car for the first time. Now, there is another side to it, which is the producer side, the workers. Here, the world has been entirely changed. I mean, to a point which is unthinkable. The assembly line has been entirely dismantled to China and to everywhere in the world. But certainly, the big thing that is changing today is the following area, which goes with that, because this is perhaps the most important point, is the fact that in the previous industrial revolution, you were asked to repeat the same thing, the same task, in order for the worker, for the human labor force, to become complementary to the source of energy brought by electricity. So mankind was behaving like a machine somehow to enjoy the benefit of the power of the machine. Today, and that's what is being brought by the software revolution, if a worker repeats the same task twice in a row, the software will replace the worker. So the tasks which are repetitive are destroyed. Well, the economists call the routine tasks are destroyed. So all the foundations of the previous industrial revolution are about to be destroyed by the software revolution. So the routine jobs are destroyed, and they were the leader of the previous revolution. Where do they go? Of course, they are destroyed, but where do they go? They go either at the very top of society, the guy for which there are really complementarities between their skill and the new tools. The guys, the golden boys who in their taxi are allowed just to time fix an order and shift $1 billion from one place to the planet to the other. And the other side of society, the non-routine jobs which are completely unskilled, such as opening the door, such as taking care of clients. The ones who are under-skilled compared to the rest of the population. This is called, in the language of the economics, the polarization of the society. The middle class is vanishing. It is replaced by software. So you see why we are making big demonstration, why economic growth is lowered. Because before it made the middle class more productive. Therefore they enjoy the sort of leverage that technology was producing. Today they are destroyed, and either you are on the very top, and yes, for the one person this is very good, but for the rest of society, it's either you are destroyed or you are pushed towards unskilled jobs who are not leveraged by the power of the new technology. So let me close because I see your chairman anxious that I close, but just to say that it's not written in the books that the future will look like the last 30 years. A lot of new complementarities will be implemented, certainly. But a caution is needed. As far as we are engaged in this post-industrial revolution, the growth potential has been way beyond expectations. And we need to understand why. Because if the reason why it is beyond expectation is because it's destroying the middle class, we understand why Hegel art was wrong as well. It's because the era of prosperity and security is not happening for the time being. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for this explosion of ideas. There are some hands raised. Are you willing to answer a few questions? Sir.
I agree with your prediction of the results of the new technologies and the internet and the IT and so on. But I totally disagree with your interpretation that will destroy the middle class. Actually, it's the liberation of the middle class, the freedom of the middle class. You yourself have said that the assembly line, as Marx says too, was actually the slavery. It was the slavery of the middle class. People had to work under conditions of dictatorship inside the assembly line. The IT technology, the internet and so on, which have shifted the jobs to software, to automation and so on, to robotics, had liberated the middle class from this serfdom in the factory and enabled them now to use their mind, not just their hands, to create, to imagine, to innovate. And this, I think, is the greatest that happened. I think this will be the rise of the middle class and the creation of wealth in the middle rather than the few wealthy people from poverty. What do you think about this?
No, you speak exactly like Engelhardt. Which I admire. He said exactly that. He said the information revolution will replace authority by creativity, because workers will be asked to react to the flow of information as opposed to what they had to do in the obedient society of the future. So that's exactly what you claim. The thing is, we're not speaking of statistics and so on, but the thing is, if creativity, instead of being a value that we all cherish, certainly in this room, becomes an economic imperative, either you are creative or you die. There is no job. If you repeat yourself, then the software will do it. This society becomes unbearable. Freud explained that creativity, like the scientist in civilization and his content, he exactly makes a list of what makes people happy. And he says, yeah, happy like the artist, fantastic, but imagine the life of an artist. If he fails to be creative, he would die. That's not the promise of the society at large. He has a scientist. He said a scientist will discover a new law, extraordinary. Do you think a full society can rely on this way of working? He has love. Love is great, but you're never as insecure as when you are in love with someone, because he may stop loving you. So in the end, he says, work as we know it is a solution to the human love. So I go back to our discussion. If you need to be creative in order to find your place in society, then stress, psychological disorder becomes the name of the game. And this is what we observe, the burnout syndrome, the stress that has replaced physical problems in the old world is what's going on now. So I'm siding with you, just like with Engelhardt, and ask, what is it, what should we do? What kind of social compact we need to invent to make this promise a promise rather than a threat? And that's not obvious. And to put it very simply, there are really two ways. One, which is managing people by stress. Yeah, that's good, be stressed, produce things. Although we know that it doesn't work like that. And people under stress have been a lot of psychological experiments to show that when you are under stress, you are less productive than when you are cool. So, but that's the way the world is going now. And in our debate in France, it's really the question all over the place is, should we add a layer of economic insecurity to the workers to make sure that they want to work, as opposed to overprotecting them by the welfare state? This is exactly, it's very difficult to find an answer. It's easy to say, protect the guy, but this is really what this debate is all about. And it's not obvious to find a nice answer, a simple answer. It seems that the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, has found better solutions than the one that has been experienced in Germany, for instance, in which you have the mini jobs for 400 euros, in which you work with zero social security, no right to no entitlement to retirement, and so on, just in order to make sure that the unskilled worker are incentivized to find a job. So I'm closing this passage to say that the world in which we are today is below these promises because the way it works is really to create insecurity in name of creativity. And it's difficult to reconcile both, and this is what I think the current political debates are exactly all about.
And reform our education system.
Education, tertiary education, all the money for the Cyprus Institute.
Okay, so we have, of course, spent a bit of time, but all our brains are, in excited states. Costas, one last observation.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for this delusion of ideas, challenges, questions. Feast. Thank you very much. In this discussion of growth, I cannot but put the question, it must be 15 years now, when this book from the Club of Rome came, Limits of Growth. Because there is a boundary condition of the Rome. It's called boundary limits, which all this debate is devoid of. And climate change, energy constraints clearly indicate that we're hitting this, what we've done, what externalities are far more expensive, etc. While this discussion was mostly about utility functions, rather than limits of growth. So I just wanted to raise this question, which I'm sure is not escaping the economic debate, but somehow it was not mentioned.
No, thank you. I should have mentioned that obviously. I just published the book in this first chapter dedicated to that. This is the underlying question, and it's very obvious that the reason why we need to ask why we are so addicted to growth, the reason why it is so important today, is because we can't go as usual. Business cannot go as usual. We need to think deeper as to what are the social needs in order to make sure that we are not growing just because we want to reach the social need, which has nothing to do with growth. So it's obviously absolutely essential. And the way I look at things today, and that may change because again, think of demographic transition, the switch from quantity to quality is not that far. I'm not as pessimistic as I may sound the way I speak about it because I believe in it. I think the aspiration out there. It's just a matter of finding the right catalyst. But my way of speaking about that is to say, you cannot ask someone depressed to stop smoking because he needs to smoke in order to sustain his anxiety. I think all societies are really anxious. So telling them no growth and get rid of that, it cannot be heard in the current debate. Although, I think there are very positive signs that are rising from all over the quarters on these concerns. So I think this discussion that I started here precedes the discussion on what kind of growth we want and how do we encompass the climatic change. Because of that. It's a prolegomena to the discussion. Absolutely.
So maybe we should thank our speaker for a very, very stimulating